Yo, um, this is going to be a little involved, this lecture, so welcome to the lecture. I'm not going to hit all the details. That's for you to read. I'm just going to point out some basics and try to keep my computer from bouncing around, and then I'll leave it up to you to read the rest of the material. And I may jump around a little bit. I may pause a lot because I want to make sure that I'm not getting too long and drawn out with this. It may be kind of a longish lecture, but we'll see how it goes. So what I'm going to do is introduce you to some structures. Some of this, I'm sure if you had some basic biology, will be familiar to you. And I'm sure that maybe one or two of you have never heard of this junk. But and it's not something you're going to want to jump up and run around in the house clapping your hands going, oh, how marvelous, because it's just basic science, but it's about your brain. And it starts off with and our discussion starts off with the idea that your whole body is made out of cells. We all know that. We all know all those basic seventh grade science things, but most of the time you don't get a detailed description of what's going on in your brain. So that's what I'm kind of going to do a little bit of now. So with all that presentation beginning, let's do the presentation itself. Um, we view mental activity, mental experiences, kind of as a holistic thing. I don't necessarily view it individually, as in things working together. In my intro classes, I know some of you are in my intro class. I talked to you about how much of your brain do you use. Excuse me, sorry, this stuff doesn't bore me. I'm just sleepy. Uh, the idea that many have is, oh, well, you only use 10% of your brain. And if you used 100%, we could see through walls and there would be mental telepathy. And that's absurd. You use 100% of your brain because the word network is what alerts you to that. Your brain works in conjunction with itself. The parts equal the whole. So there's a lot of activity that goes on there. How can that be? Well, there has to be some interconnection. And what is interconnected? Cells. If you had one cell, or if you had 10% of the cells in your brain working and all the rest of them sitting around smoking and having a whatever, no, that wouldn't work for you. You would be in the ICU unit somewhere with brain damage. So you have all this stuff working together, all of these huge numbers of cells working together, and the result is a lot of ability. I'm not talking about being able to do marvelous things with your memory, etc. I'm just saying a lot of things, natural things, breathing, for example, seeing, etc. So let's break this down. Let's look at what these parts are. And we begin with neurons. Your nervous system is made up of two different kinds of cells, neurons and glia. Some people call them glia. I don't care what you call it, as long as you spell it right, Glia. Neurons are receptors. They receive information and they transmit it to other cells. They're kind of like the Ubers. They get the information, they put the information in the neuron, and it runs over here and gives it to another cell. It really doesn't move anywhere. We'll talk about glia later. So, the human brain has just a few of these things, somewhere around 86 billion neurons. So there you go, 100%, right? That's average. Some people have more, some people have less. Uh, don't don't really know why, and there's some speculation as to what maybe the effects of that. But as you read through the history in the chapter, some of that will come out for you. I'm not going to go into that basically now. we're going to use animal cells. Since we're animals, we're going to use those as our structure explanation. So let's jump right into that and away from this kind of a ground laying thing. Uh, Neurons, of course, make up the cerebellum. Now, your book, I think, uses a mouse as the illustrator of what these things do. I'm not worried about what animal we're talking about. I'm worried about you understanding the cerebellum. So there's a lot of commonality in neurons in the cerebellum and also in the rest of your body. You find that out when you look at a lot of the systems. Some of you, I don't know, I didn't ask when we were in class, and I obviously haven't spoken with my online folk, but some of you may eventually wind up in the medical field. You're going to nursing, and you're going to find out the repetition that's built into your body. Let's look at what a neuron is made of. The cell. The cell has a membrane, a plasma membrane that separates the inside of the cell from the outside environment, helps guard against damage. Uh, Most chemicals in your body and from outside of your body cannot cross that membrane, but we need protein to get in there. So it's designed with these little creaks, these little holes, if you will, these little channels that control and permit things like water, oxygen, salt, i.e., sodium, potassium, calcium, other important chemicals, including chloride, believe it or not, to enter into the cell. And obviously, there's function for that. There are these structures called ribosomes. Ribosomes synthesize, new protein molecules. Synthesize means put together, basically. And then you have areas where these things attach to for various reasons. Again, I'm not going to get into hyper detail about this. Those are called endoplasmic reticulum. Again, you'll read about this. So some things float freely in the cell, ribosomes, while others attach to this endoplasmic reticulum. And then there's a new synthesis that takes place. You've probably heard of this, a mitochondrion. Mitochondria is the plural of that. This, again, is part of the cell. It performs metabolic activities. Metabolism it's a process. I know you've all heard of, well, you get older, your metabolism slows down. Well, that's kind of a different metabolism, but it has its genesis here. And there's energy from that your cell uses for activities. I just finished doing a rugby workout today, so my metabolism is still elevated. And that's directly related to what we're talking about here, the mitochondria. Mitochondria aren't all the same. They have their own genes. They're separate from those that the nucleus has of the cell. And you inherit these. So these things come from what's called cytoplasm in an egg cell. So you get these from your mom, your biological mother, and she got them from her mother. So this goes back generation after generation. Brain activity requires a lot more energy than the activity of any other organ. So this is going to play a role in that. Your brain is dependent on good mitochondrial function. What does that tell you about genetics? If I'm inheriting this mitochondria from my mom, what is my mom's physical background and even her mental background capabilities? And why do we worry about it? Because we're talking about good health, bad health, abilities, capabilities, etc. Healthy mitochondria promote health. They promote good brain activity. And here's a biggie, cognition. So mitochondria, uh, if you struggle in school, maybe you can blame it on your mitochondrial functioning. I'm not making a joke, it's true. Uh, they can be less active than average because the genes uh, may contain toxic chemicals. Stress can have an effect on it. Illnesses can have an effect on it. Illnesses that produce inflammation. Hope my computer's going to settle down here. Uh, Decreased mitochondrial function means decreased mental energy. So, what does that mean? It can lead to things like depression, uh, impairments in mitochondria can be linked to epilepsy, Alzheimer's. Yes, we do know some things about Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, a lot of things related to malfunction of these of mitochondria. Very important thing. I think you get that. Let's look quickly at the structure of neurons. I'll leave mitochondria alone for a little bit. Uh, the shape of a cell is very distinctive in terms of what it's designed to do. All neurons have a cell body. Term for that is a soma, S-O-M-A. And most have dendrites. We'll worry about dendrites later. An axon, these are structures you can read about. And presynaptic terminals. What's a synapse? It's a communication between cells. Little neurons don't have axons, and some neurons don't have well-defined dendrites. There's a thing related to study, and I'm going to use it to kind of make sense out of this for you. It's called, oh my gosh, I've forgotten what it's called. Oh, long-term potentiation. What happens in long-term potentiation? Well, study. Got an exam coming up, and I begin to study for it. And you've probably all been cautioned, don't memorize things, because you memorize it, where does it go? Short-term memory, working memory. You use it, and it's not important anymore because it's been used, and you pass the exam, and you go, glad I'm done with that. Well, guess what? If you spend enough time, and this is not always a guarantee, but many times you spend enough time in memorization, there is a potential, that's why it's called long-term potentiation, that you will actually increase the number of dendrites. This is theory. What does that mean? Better synapses. In other words, you got a better chance of getting this junk into your long-term memory. So now it's 6 months later, or let's be realistic. This was on the first test, and now it's the final exam 7 weeks later, and lo and behold, you remember those answers from that first test because you really studied your off, and boom, it worked. There's a better method. We won't go into that because this isn't a study of memory. But that's just an example of what we're talking about here, these dendrites. Motor neurons. A motor neuron has its soma in the spinal cord. It receives messages through the dendrites, and then it conducts impulses from an axon to a muscle. These are just illustrations of what these specializations are. A sensory neuron is sensitive to particular types of stimulation. So you have sensory neurons related to vision, all 5 senses, smell, blah, blah, blah. It conducts, for example, touch information from your skin, because that's where that takes place, anywhere on your body, to the spinal cord. And then it goes through the process. goes through the process of conduction where it winds up in your brain, and then perception takes place. Understanding. What's this sense? Well, touch has been activated. That's all you know. That's the sensory level. That's the neuronal level. Excuse me. And then the information goes to your brain eventually, usually boom like that. And you go, oh, I'm touching a cool hard surface, or whatever the case is. Excuse me. Dendrites, the surface of these things are lined with synaptic receptors. And that's where the dendrites receive information. I'm sorry. Dendrites also have dendrite spines, dendritic spines. And they're short outgrowths that increase the surface area. So all of this means that there's a function there that can be very good, or it can be average, or it can be below average, depending on how this stuff develops. Developmental psychology, if you ever take that, talks a little bit about that, but not a lot. Nucleus, ribosomes, mitochondria. That's the cell body. I mentioned the word axon earlier. Let's look at that real quick. An axon's a thin fiber. It conveys an impulse to other neurons, or to an organ, or to a muscle. So they're little bitty things, but they do a great big lot of work. They are from your spinal cord all the way down to your feet. And then they have those little branches on the end. Vertebrate axons have an insulating material called a myelin sheath. And at various stages, they have interruptions. Those are known as nodes of Ranvier. Invertebrate axons don't have myelin sheaths. And there's a reason behind that. Again, I'm going to let you read about that because I'll get bogged down because it's very interesting. And then we have what's known as a presynaptic terminal, end bulb, or bouton. That's a French word for button. That's where the axon releases chemicals that cross over to another cell. Why are they doing that? That's a communication system. If you have questions, email me because I don't really want to get too hung up in class talking about these things, and they're very confusing. So we'll save class time for the discussions, but don't be shy about asking me questions. All right, so I mentioned that we have cells, neurons, and I mentioned glia. They're also known as neuroglia. That's the other component of your nervous system, neurons and glia. Glia really means glue in Greek, and it's the idea that it holds the neurons, that glia holds the neurons together, but that's really obsolete. Early studies and work in this area led scientists to believe that glia outnumbered neurons. But the fact of the matter is that there's a ratio. Sometimes they outnumber them. Sometimes it's the other way around. I'm sorry about this frog in my throat. I don't know where it came from. Ratios of neurons, glia, varies from one brain area to another. So it depends on where you're talking as far as the brain goes. You have several types of glia. There are star-shaped called astrocytes. They wrap around dendrites, and they are related to axons. So the function is the passing of information. You may have a single astrocyte, and it might surround a lot of dendrites, hundreds of dendrites. Just depends on what the function is. There's a connection between neurons and an astrocyte in terms of protection. The protection is to shield the the uh, connection from chemicals that are circulating around in your system. And then they also take up ions and they transmit, and transmitters that are released by axons. I know this is a little confusing, and you're not going to get asked a lot of this on a quiz or test, so don't worry about it. But there's a synchronization that needs to take place. And that synchronization with these things, with the release, the transmitters released by axons, uh, allows axons to send messages. And they pulsate these messages. So, what's the point in that? Well, a pulsating message would affect things like your breathing. They also are capable of dilating blood vessels, so you get more nutrients into active brain areas. Why do you need more nutrients? Because you need to have fuel to think. Some brain areas, in some areas of your brain, astrocytes respond to hormones and they influence neurons. They also control modification of the visual cortex early in life. So if this is a malfunction, then you may not be able to see, or you may never develop the ability to see. Uh, Astrocytes hold hands with neurons. They're buddies, they're pals. Now, microglia, and we're almost done. Tiny cells, they're called microglia. They're part of the immune system. They remove viruses and they remove fungi from the brain. Fungus in your brain, that's cool, isn't it? After you've been injured, if you have a brain injury, they use the word proliferate. The science does. It means they go boom, they get big. They remove dead or damaged neurons. So the idea that you can't heal in your brain can't heal is not entirely true. There's some areas that can. Uh, Astrocytes, microglia work together to prune ineffective synapses, and it adjusts the effectiveness of it. Also, others that are working okay. Inappropriate synapses and the pruning of that is very important. Too much pruning or too little pruning, for instance, during development can cause development disorders. And then microglia provide negative feedback to put brakes on, so to speak, of neuronal activity. If you have a loss of microglia, you can develop seizures. So that's really kind of a wrap up. That was a little bit longer than I wanted to go. Read about, I love this word, oligodendrites. It's hard to say. But if you say it in a conversation with people you like, they'll think you're smart. So whatever you want to do with it, but do read about it. And I'll be back with you in another lecture shortly. Take care.